One introduction: Rosep view the United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building, for just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the eco-design wood stove, and international convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. Rosep view purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary. Episode 57 DGL, April 10th, 2025. Civil war ideology and time to cash in on stock prices possibly indicated by Trump. In episode 57 DGL, 1 United States Civil War ideology, 2 headlines. The New York Times, April 10th, 2025. 3 United States egg prices continued to rise in March. 4th United States best of late night finds Trump to be his own worst enemy. 5 United States guest essay, Democrats can be the party that wants to make Americans rich. 6 United States Speaker Mike Johnson on Wednesday was forced to delay a vote on the Republican budget blueprint to unlock the Trump domestic agenda after conservatives balked at a plan that they said would add too much to the U.S. debt. 7 United States the Trump encouragement of stock investors draws scrutiny. Was Trump manipulating the market with his comments, as his critics say, or reassuring Americans, as the White House maintains? Democrats and government ethics experts are asking whether Trump, in pausing tariffs, gave the green light to his followers to cash in on a forthcoming rise in stock prices. 8 Arizona, as his chronic disease tour wraps, Kennedy hits his stride. 9 California, Kamala Harris sidelined and still processing her defeat. Harris looks for a way back. 10 Canada Alberta Pierre Poilievre outside his political base, a Canadian Trumpian pitch is a harder sell. 11 United Kingdom, can Britain be a sensible stable haven in trade war? Some see potential. 12 United Kingdom U.S. bond sell-off is another worrisome echo of the Liz Truss fiasco. 13 Germany traders on the floor of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange on Thursday, a day after Trump announced a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs. Main content: 1 United States Civil War ideology, excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. Substack letters from an American, Heather Cox Richardson, April 9th, 2025. The events of April 9th, 1865. The surrender of Robert E. Lee 160 years ago today reassured Americans that they had in fact saved the last best hope of Earth democracy. So confident was General Grant in the justice of his people and in the justice of the Union cause that he asked only that Lee and his men give their word that they would never again fight against the United States, and that they turn over their military arms and artillery. The men could keep their sidearms and their horses, because Grant wanted them to be able to put in a crop to carry themselves and their families through the next winter. Their victory on the battlefields made Northerners think they had made sure that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth, but their conviction that generosity would bring white Southerners around to accepting the equality promised in the Declaration of Independence backfired after the assassination of Lincoln. Andrew Johnson of Tennessee took over the presidency and worked hard to restore white supremacy without the old legal structure of enslavement, while white settlers in the West brought their hierarchical ideas with them and imposed them on indigenous Americans, on Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and on Asians and Pacific Islanders with no penalty for their attempt to overthrow democracy. Those who thought that white men were better than others began to insist that their cause was just, and that they had lost the war only because they had been overpowered. They continued to work to make their ideology the law of the land. That idea inspired the Jim Crow and Juan Crow laws of the late 19th and 20th centuries, as well as the policies that crowded indigenous Americans onto reservations, where disease and malnutrition killed many of them and lack of opportunity pushed the rest into poverty. In the 1930s, Nazi leaders, lawyers, and judges turned to Jim Crow laws of America and Indian reservations for inspiration on how to create legal hierarchies that would at the very least wall certain populations off from white society. The gulf between the ideals of democracy and the reality of life in the segregated U.S. during and after World War II galvanized Black Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans to demand equality, they successfully challenged school segregation, racial, housing restriction, state laws, prohibiting interracial marriage, and anti-Chinese laws based in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. As the military fought fascism in Europe, schools and churches at home emphasized that democracy depended on acceptance of racial, ethnic, and religious differences. In a 1947 radio show, Superman fought a Ku Klux Klan-like gang trying to keep foreign-born players off high school sports teams, and in 1949 comic book artist Wayne Boring portrayed him on a poster urging a group of American schoolchildren to defend their classmates from un-American attacks on their race, religion, or ethnicity. In the 1950s, those ideas had produced a liberal consensus shared by most Democrats and Republicans alike. The government should regulate business, provide for basic social welfare, and promote infrastructure. In other words, it should reflect democratic values. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and gradually came to include people of color and women who demanded equality. In 1980, Ronald Reagan rode the idea that the liberal consensus was simply a way to redistribute wealth to undeserving Americans of color or women or both, like the welfare queen image posited by Reagan into the White House, as more than $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1% between 1981 and 2021. Republicans deflected attention from the hollowing out of the middle class by demonizing racial, religious, and gender minorities. By 2012, they were talking of makers and takers, and by 2016, they were feeding voters ideas and images straight out of the U.S. white supremacist past. By 2021, the idea that some people are better than others and have a right to rule, the same ideology that had driven the Confederates created a mob determined to end American democracy, the rioters who attacked the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, believed they were writing a new history of the United States, one that brought to life the hierarchical version of American history claimed by the Confederates before them. On that day, one of the rioters accomplished what the Southern troops during the Civil War had never been able to. He carried the Confederate battle flag into the United States Capitol. At the end of his life, General Grant recalled the events of April 9, 1865, what the feelings of General Lee were I do not know. Grant wrote, my own feelings, which had been quite jubilant on the receipt of his letter asking to surrender, were sad and depressed. I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. Two headlines. The New York Times, April 10th. 2025 appeals court clears path for Trump to resume firing probationary workers. The New York Times. Egg prices continue to rise in March. The New York Times. House strikes down $5 overdraft fee limit, sending issue to Trump. The New York Times. Inflation eased in March, but tariffs raise risk of higher prices. The New York Times. Inside the Trump reversal on tariffs from Be Cool to getting yippee. The New York Times. Late night finds Trump to be his own worst enemy. The New York Times. Launch of first Amazon project Kuiper internet satellites is scrubbed. The New York Times. Opinion. This moment is a cataclysm, but we can still act. The New York Times. Opinion. Democrats can be the party that wants to make Americans rich. The New York Times. Opinion. The damage from the Trump tariff pause is already done. The New York Times. Opinion. What Trump just cost America. The New York Times. Opinion. Who needs free trade when you can raise your own chickens? The New York Times. The Trump retreat. The New York Times. The next generation of Democrats do not plan to wait their turn. The New York Times. The pandemic is not the only reason U.S. students are losing ground. The New York Times. To escape the grind, young people turn to mini retirements. The New York Times. Trump administration cuts aid programs it had promised to keep. The New York Times. Trump live updates Johnson to try for vote on GOP budget after major setback. The New York Times. Trump signs orders punishing those who opposed his 2020 election. Lies. The New York Times. Trump threatens climate policies in the states. The New York Times. The Trump encouragement of stock investors draws scrutiny. The New York Times. Arizona. RFK Jr. hits his stride in Arizona as his chronic disease tour wraps. The New York Times. California. Kamala Harris sidelined and still processing her defeat. Harris looks for a way back. In the New York Times. Massachusetts. Trump has targeted universities like Harvard, Cornell, Columbia. Why. The New York Times. Missouri. St. Louis judges embrace ankle monitors amid calls to reform bail. The New York Times. Canada. A hit in Alberta. The Poilievre populism falters elsewhere in Canada. The New York Times. United Kingdom. Can Britain be a sensible, stable haven in trade war? Some see potential. The New York Times. United Kingdom. U.S. bond sell-off is another worrisome echo of the Liz Truss fiasco. The New York Times. United Kingdom UK version of Saturday Night Live will start in 2026. The New York Times. European Union. Trump tariffs live updates. EU pauses new tariffs on U.S. goods after Trump backs down. The New York Times. Italy. Prada buys Versace. The New York Times. Ukraine and Russia. How a Ukrainian teen became a suspected foot soldier for Russia. The New York Times. Russia freed Ksenia Karelina. A detained American. Rubio says. The New York Times. Somalia. Trump team divided over future of U.S. embassy in Somalia. The New York Times. China. How will the Trump-China tariffs affect prices here? Is what could get more expensive. The New York Times. China criticizes J.D. Vance for calling its people peasants. The New York Times. China says its own consumers will save the day, but they are not buying. The New York Times. China. U.S. and China headed for monumental split, putting world economy on edge. The New York Times. 3. United States egg prices continue to rise in March. Egg prices have reached record highs as bird flu outbreaks have hit poultry farms and forced producers to cull tens of millions of hens. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times. April 10th, 2025. For weeks, Trump has repeatedly boasted that his administration had managed to bring egg prices down, but new data on Thursday showed that egg prices at the grocery store continued to climb. In March, egg prices rose 5.9% over the month, according to data released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They climbed at a slower rate, though, after rising 10.4% in February and 15.2% in January. Compared with a year earlier, egg prices are up 60.4%. Egg prices have reached record highs in recent months as bird flu outbreaks have hit poultry farms and forced producers to cull tens of millions of hens, but Trump, who had vowed to bring down grocery prices while on the campaign trail, has continued to claim victory on egg prices this month. Trump said that egg prices had dropped 59%, and on Monday, he said that egg prices were down 79%. Consumers might not be feeling relief because Trump is not referring to retail egg prices, he is instead pointing to the wholesale price of eggs, which has fallen by roughly half since the beginning of his second-term. Wholesale egg prices dropped from a national average of $6.55 a dozen on January 24th to $3.26 on April 4th, according to data from the Agriculture Department. Wholesale egg prices are also down from a peak of more than $8 a dozen at the end of February, but the average retail price for a dozen large eggs reached $6.23 in March, up from $5.90 the month before, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. It could take several weeks for the decrease in wholesale prices to pass through to retail prices, said a food economist at Michigan State University. All indications are that there is some relief coming for consumers. Even then, there are a lot of other factors that determine the price of eggs. Wholesale egg prices have come down significantly as poultry farms report fewer bird flu outbreaks. Supply has increased and consumer demand has weakened, economists say, but it is difficult to know exactly how much retail egg prices could come down. New avian flu outbreaks could continue to put pressure on egg prices, and even though a drop in wholesale egg prices typically translates to lower prices at the grocery store, retailers do not necessarily have to pass all of the savings to consumers. For United States best of late night finds Trump to be his own worst enemy, yet Trump was like, "I just saved the economy from me. You are welcome," Jimmy Fallon said on The Tonight Show. Excerpts edited by Worrisome for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, April 10th, 2025. Jimmy Kimmel: Russia was watching Trump tank the economy and going yippee. 5 United States guest essay: Democrats can be the party that wants to make Americans rich. Excerpts edited by Worrisome for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, April 10th, 2025. The polling is clear. Democratic voters hate tariffs. In a late March YouGov poll for CBS News, 88% of Democratic respondents said they oppose new tariffs on imported goods. That poll was taken before Trump announced huge new tariffs on April 2nd that caused the S&P 500 to dive 10% in 2 days and the American public to get a crash course in trade economics. After a week of financial market carnage, Trump relented partly. He is still proceeding with a 125% tariff on China and 10% on most of the rest of the world. In response, the markets partly recovered on Friday. Trump posted on social media to the many investors coming into the United States that this is a great time to get rich. This was obviously wrong. Stocks were tanking because Trump has made it a poor time to invest in the United States. But Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Minority Leader, accepted the Trump premise, reposting his message and adding, "And the rich get richer," on a day when the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 2,000 points. Other Democrats have insisted that the Trump trade policies are not trade policies at all. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut put out a video insisting that the Trump tariffs are a political weapon designed to collapse our democracy. As Murphy points out, one problem with the tariffs is the Trump mercurial nature and his desire to have chief executives begging in the Oval Office for exemptions from his destructive policies. I have recently heard Republicans mouthing talking points I would never have imagined. They are out there declaring that cheap goods, also known as low prices, are not important, that a crashing stock market is just an opportunity for Main Street to rise in its wake, and that voters would not mind if the Trump attempted national project of reindustrialization forces them to pay higher prices. People are not going to enjoy hearing this. Americans enjoy the highest median incomes in the world, save for a few tiny countries, including Switzerland and Luxembourg. Our defining national characteristic is our openness to commerce, innovation, hard work, and growth, and the lifestyle that openness makes possible. That prosperity is what makes people from all over the world want to move here. Now Trump is ripping that away from us, and the zombified Republican Party is lining up behind him to explain why that is actually good, and we should be happy about it. Democrats have an enormous opportunity, and they would be crazy not to seize it. 6 United States Speaker Mike Johnson on Wednesday was forced to delay a vote on the Republican budget blueprint to unlock the Trump domestic agenda after conservatives balked at a plan that they said would add too much to the U.S. debt. Excerpts edited by Worrisome for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, April 9th, 2025. In a dramatic scene on Capitol Hill that laid bare Republican divisions, Johnson huddled with the holdouts in a room off the House floor for over an hour before the vote was scheduled to begin, grinding activity in the chamber to a halt as the fate of the measure hung in the balance. It has been a tried and true tactic for Johnson, who has previously succeeded at wearing down conservative opposition on the House floor by essentially daring would-be defectors to derail planned votes on the Trump priorities. But Wednesday night was a rare instance in which the hard-right Republicans refused to blink, at least for now, and it dealt the Speaker, who had confidently predicted he would have the votes to push the measure through, a bruising setback. Johnson emerged from the closed-door meeting on Wednesday night and told reporters the House would vote on the measure probably tomorrow one way or the other. There were still a small subset of members who were not totally satisfied with the bill. He said those lawmakers who continued to huddle privately after Johnson delayed the vote said they were seeking more assurances that the Senate would ultimately come up with deeper spending cuts than the resolution required. 7 United States. The Trump encouragement of stock investors draws scrutiny. Was Trump manipulating the market with his comments, as his critics say, or reassuring Americans, as the White House maintains? Democrats and government ethics experts are asking whether Trump, in pausing tariffs, gave the green light to his followers to cash in on a forthcoming rise in stock prices. Excerpts edited by Worrisome for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, April 10th, 2025. Trump began his Wednesday with some advice for those rattled by steep tariffs. Be cool, Trump told his followers on social media after the markets opened. Just a couple of minutes later, he wrote, "This is a great time to buy DJT hours after that, Trump sent the market soaring when he paused the levies for 90 days. The S&P 500 climbed several percentage points in a matter of minutes and was on its way to its best day since the recovery of the 2008 financial crisis. Soon after the Trump pause, Democrats and government ethics experts asked the perhaps obvious question: did Trump give the green light to his followers to cash in on a forthcoming rise in stock prices? How is this not market manipulation? Representative Mike Levin, Democrat of California, said on social media, referring to action that is potentially illegal if you are a Trump supporter and you did what he said and you bought, then you did great. On the other hand, if you are a retiree or a senior or somebody in the middle class over the last few days that did not have the tolerance for risk and you decided to sell, you got screwed. So, if it is not market manipulation, what is it? Who is benefiting? What billionaire just got richer? White House officials have rejected such accusations as they have claimed that the Trump post was meant to reassure Americans. Senator Adam B. Schiff, Democrat of California, said he would reach out to the White House and seek to learn more about who knew of the Trump impending decision to pause the tariffs. He said the flip-flop provided dangerous opportunities for insider trading. Did anyone buy or sell stocks and profit at the expense of the public? Schiff asked on social media. A professor focusing on government ethics and corruption at the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis said the Trump actions would ordinarily trigger an investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Such investigators would be looking for evidence that Trump knew he was going to make an announcement that would move the market and then provided a clue to his followers. If we still had a rule of law, a robust system for the rule of law, it would be investigated, she said in a statement. The SEC, which reviews possible violations of federal securities laws, declined to respond to questions about the Trump post. 8 Arizona. As his chronic disease tour wraps, Kennedy hits his stride. The health secretary seemed stoic, maybe nervous, even at the start of his first major trip, but on a hike with Navajo Nation leaders, he was finally in his element. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. April 9, 2025. Kennedy had left Washington with questions growing about his handling of a measles outbreak in West Texas and the firing of thousands of Department of Health and Human Services employees. On his way out west, he had to make a stop in Texas on Sunday to attend the funeral of an unvaccinated 8-year-old girl, the second child to die of measles in this outbreak. By Tuesday, Kennedy had loosened up, wearing a Stegosaurus tie and shaking hands with a Navajo toddler at a health center near Phoenix. As the boy learned to cook blue corn crepes, the health secretary poked his head into the refrigerators of a food distribution center, examining food labels and nodding as he said, very impressive. On his descent from the hike, a delegate of the Navajo Nation Council, who has struggled to obtain diabetes medication, intercepted the secretary and unzipped her jacket to reveal a t-shirt with a handwritten phrase on it: Save IHS Jobs and Diabetes Program. IHS stands for the Federal Indian Health Service, a subtle message, she quipped. 9 California. Kamala Harris, sidelined and still processing her defeat. Harris looks for a way back in a successful campaign for governor of California in 2026. Kamala Harris has told allies would give her a prominent perch from which to push back against Trump and defend Democratic priorities. Former Vice President Kamala Harris has not decided her next move, but some of her closest allies say she is leaning toward a run for governor of California that would all but foreclose the possibility of running for president in the next election. A successful campaign for governor of California in 2026, Kamala Harris has told allies would give her a prominent perch from which to push back against Trump and defend Democratic priorities. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. April 10, 2025. Kamala Harris felt compelled to speak out about what Trump was doing to the country, but not enough to attack him by name. 2 days earlier, the law firm that hired her husband Doug Emhoff with a multi-million-dollar salary had struck a deal with the White House to avoid crippling sanctions. An agreement Emhoff had objected to beforehand in private talks with the leaders of the firm. Now Ms. Harris wanted to make it known she was uncomfortable with such acquiescence. There is a sense of fear that is taking hold in our country, she told an audience of black women on April 3rd in some of her most forceful remarks since November, her voice rising. She added, we are seeing those that are capitulating to clearly unconstitutional threats 5 months after being driven from public office for the first time in more than 2 decades. The former vice president is carefully feeling her way forward as she plots her next move. She is navigating between Trump, who is using his executive power to crush those he sees as his strongest adversaries, and rest of Democrats who want their leaders to be the picture of defiance. Friends, former aides, and advisors say Ms. Harris, 60, still thinks she would have beaten Trump if she would have had more than 107 days to campaign. The implication being that former President Joseph R. Biden Jr. should have quit the race earlier, while other prominent Democrats, including Gov. Tim Walz of Minnesota, her former running mate, have asserted themselves in the struggle of the Democratic Party to chart a path to a comeback. With town hall events, podcasts, speeches, and television appearances, Ms. Harris has given no interviews and has largely avoided the spotlight. 10 Canada Alberta Pierre Poilievre. Outside his political base, a Canadian Trumpian pitch is a harder sell. Pierre Poilievre, the conservative seeking to become prime minister, fires up the faithful in Alberta, including Trump supporters, with his anti-elitist, anti-woke message during a rally this week in Nisku, just south of Edmonton, Alberta. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, April 10, 2025. He railed against an economy that he said was a transfer of wealth from the have-nots to the have-yachts. He whipped up thunderous applause with his vow to bring our money home. He pledged that beefed-up armed forces in Canada would be guided by a warrior culture, not a woke culture. He promised to eliminate the CBC, the public broadcaster he has accused of liberal bias. Alberta, the oil-rich province in Western Canada, is the birthplace both of Poilievre, 45, and the right-wing populist movement that has come to dominate the Conservative Party of Canada. The message of Poilievre, message of common sense against a purportedly corrupt elite, resonates the most in Alberta, along with neighboring Saskatchewan, where support is also highest in Canada for the man who has upended its political Landscape Trump most polls show Poilievre and the Conservatives behind the Liberal Party, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney 60, by about 7 percentage points. In Ontario, the province with the largest number of voters, moderate Conservatives allied with the provincial government have chosen not to help the Poilievre campaign and are working with the Carney government to challenge the tariffs by the Trump administration. A high-ranking Conservative official in Ontario said publicly that Poilievre was too much like Trump. Now that most Canadians view Trump, who has vowed to annex Canada, as the greatest threat facing their country, being too much like Trump is considered a liability, except perhaps among some Conservatives, including those who showed up at the rally this week in Nisku, just south of Edmonton. But the Poilievre Trump-like populism is not playing well elsewhere in Canada. The Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a moderate Conservative who has been one of the most visible leaders in Canada in battling the Trump tariffs, has praised Carney and refrained from helping the Poilievre campaign. The campaign manager for Doug Ford told an audience in Toronto that Poilievre looks too much like Trump. He sounds too much like Trump. 11 United Kingdom. Can Britain be a sensible, stable haven in trade war? Some see potential. The country faces several economic challenges, but so far has avoided the worst of the turmoil afflicting targets of Trump. Anger excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. April 10, 2025. Britain became a byword for self-inflicted economic harm and instability after Brexit and the calamitous tax cuts of former Prime Minister Liz Truss, but now the country sees an opportunity to serve as a haven from the trade war that is rattling markets and the global economy. Last week, Trump limited the U.S. tariffs on Britain to the baseline rate of 10%, and his administration has been engaging in talks on a trade deal focused on technology. Though a deal has yet to materialize, Britain has avoided being a main target of the Trump ire over trade relationships. To be sure, some of that advantage was ceded late on Wednesday when Trump said he would pause for 90 days. The higher reciprocal tariffs on countries other than China, setting all other tariffs at a universal 10%, that leaves Britain subject to the same blanket tariffs as a host of countries that have not been as solicitous toward Washington. Still, the European Union, Japan, Vietnam, and dozens of others now have to negotiate to avoid higher tariffs from being reimposed, raising the stakes. The Home Secretary of Britain said on Thursday that British officials were trying to strengthen trade relations with other countries, including the European Union. Ms. Cooper said that Britain was focused on being a stable place for investors, highlighting that Universal Studios announced plans to build a massive theme park in the country, its first in Europe. The backtracking by Trump on reciprocal tariffs reinforces the strategy and the approach we are taking, which is to be pragmatic, to take this steady course rather than to get buffeted around from day to day. The U.S. Trump assault on foreign trade will overshadow the missteps of the United Kingdom elections last summer handed the Labour Party of Prime Minister Keir Starmer a large majority in Parliament. The government has at times struggled to find its footing, but has not suffered the unsteadiness that has recently hit other big countries in Europe, including Germany and France. So far, the British government has not retaliated against the U.S. tariffs and is instead focused on supporting local companies. This week, Starmer eased rules on the car industry, which is facing a sector-specific 25% U.S. tariff, and the pharmaceutical sector, which appears next in line for U.S. levies. The government will shelter British business from the storm. Starmer said, "We are an open market economy. Doing international business, London could benefit from being a neutral location in international markets away from trade. Britain sees other opportunities too. Scientists and researchers in the United States have shown increasing interest in European universities amid attacks on research funding at American institutions after leaving the European Union. 5 years ago, the British government struck a deal to regain access to the Research and Innovation Funding Program flagship of the bloc. The president of Imperial College London said in a recent interview, the United Kingdom is seen as sensible, stable, ambitious, with citizens who also appreciate the importance of science. Britain is still dealing with a variety of economic challenges, including increasing private investment, strengthening public services, and reducing public debt. British government bonds are also vulnerable when there is tumult in debt markets because of the open economy of the UK and large financial sector. Global risks are particularly relevant to UK financial stability. The UK government plans to improve its finances and other actions like making it easier to build homes and infrastructure, and a pledge to keep corporate taxes stable, which would help improve the reputation of the as a place to invest. 12 United Kingdom US bond sell-off is another worrisome echo of the Liz Truss fiasco. Yields on US Treasuries rose Wednesday as investors sold government bonds, usually a haven in Britain. A sustained version of that trend in 2022 led to the downfall of a prime minister. Former British Prime Minister Liz Truss triggered market turmoil in 2022 after she proposed sweeping tax cuts. She was forced to step down after 44 days in office. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. April 9, 2025. The parallels between Trump and Liz Truss, the shortest-serving prime minister in Britain, are growing starker. Ms. Truss triggered market turmoil in 2022 after she proposed sweeping tax cuts that she proposed to pay for with massive government borrowing. Ms. Truss was ultimately doomed by fears of a credit crisis after yields on British government bonds spiked. Now yields on U.S. Treasuries are beginning to rise. Yields are still generally lower than when Trump was inaugurated, but a sustained sell-off of Treasuries would erase the key difference between the global market response to the Trump tariffs and the tax cuts of Ms. Truss. In the immediate aftermath of the Trump tariff announcement, bond yields actually drifted down even as the stock market plummeted and dollar weakened. This partly reflected expectations for slowing growth, but also served as a reminder of the traditional status of the American bond market as a haven for investors. Now that safe haven status may be crumbling, according to some analysts, at the extreme that could raise pressure on the Federal Reserve to intervene, which is what the Bank of England did in 2022 to shore up the British bond market. In the case of Britain, those dramatic events forced Ms. Truss to rescind her proposed tax cuts, and the market chaos subsided, but the credibility of Ms. Truss was destroyed, and she was forced to step down after 44 days in office. Trump, by contrast, has shown no sign that he plans to reverse the tariffs, and for now there appear to be few political levers to force his hand. A Liz Truss moment for America? The parallels between Trump and Ms. Truss are striking, but for now, there are key differences. 13 Germany traders on the floor of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange on Thursday a day after Trump announced a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs. Excerpts edited by Worrisome for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times. April 10, 2025, the European Union will pause its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports for 90 days. The bloc announced Thursday a day after Trump abruptly backed down on his punishing global levies, but the accelerating trade war between China and the United States showed no signs of abating as Trump left in place his steep tariffs aimed at Beijing. The Trump move after a week of market upheaval sent indexes in Europe and Asia higher on Thursday, after the S&P 500 rallied the day before to its biggest daily gain since 2008. His reversal prompted the European Union to put its new tariffs on hold in order to give negotiations a chance, said Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, though she warned that the tariffs would take effect if talks are not satisfactory. Trump left in place a base tariff of 10% on virtually all imports, as well as levies on auto, steel, and aluminum. Despite the reprieve for some nations, economists have been warning that the tariffs now in place will still prove costly, not only leading to slower growth, but also higher inflation.
One introduction. Rosette view. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions. Yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burn tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burn tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burn tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom. The Eco-Design Wood Stove and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. Rosette view. Purple air. PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.